We've called this series so far, Can You Trust God to Make You Happy? Can you trust God to make you happy? The sort of subtitle we've been working with is Happiness from God or Happiness DIY, because the name Jacob means schemer or deceiver. He grasped the leg of his twin brother as they came out of the womb, and that theme of scheming and deceiving and pulling the leg has characterized his whole life. But at the same time, God promised that he would bless Jacob and his family. And so Jacob's tussle all the way through his life has been whether he accepts happiness as a free gift of God's grace, or whether he tries to scheme for happiness by his own strength and his own scheming. And that theme runs through the whole Bible, as we've been seeing, right from the very start. That theme of happiness from God or happiness DIY was the challenge that Adam and Eve faced in the garden. Would they trust God and receive from him and allow him to define what was good and evil, or would they set themselves up to be like God, deciding for themselves what was good and evil by taking from that tree? Last time you were with us, so this is a couple of weeks ago before Revive, in chapter 32 we saw this amazing experience that Jacob had, an encounter with God himself. God came down, took on some kind of pre-incarnate human form, and they wrestled, and Jacob received the name Israel, and he was told that was because he had struggled with humans and with God and had overcome, and God lowered himself down and allowed Jacob to be wounded so that he received grace from God. And in that kind of prayer experience, then Jacob received the amazing gift of Esau coming to him not as someone with a great army, which was Esau's plan, but instead in grace and reconciliation. And Jacob said as he saw Esau, "I've seen the face of God," because Esau was a picture of God's grace to him and of God answering his prayer. And so we might be thinking, well, finally, Jacob has matured enough to be dependent on God, to be genuinely prayerful. This is a man who God has been working in his life since he was born, and actively since he was about 40. He's now into his 60s, and we'd think, okay, yeah, he's now a mature man of God, understood that happiness comes from God, not happiness DIY. And yet here we come to a very sad story, and I've called it When DIY Happiness Leads to Utter Misery. The muscle memory of scheming and deceiving is still there in Jacob. Whereas when Abraham's name was changed to Abraham, from then on he's always called Abraham. But with Jacob, we see his name kind of goes back and forth. We see this dual identity. And actually we see ourselves in this founding father of our faith, this first church leader, as it were, as his growing family grows under God's blessing. We see this mixture of the schemer and the dependent follower of God. And in this little section, well, the first point on your sheets, we're going to see how just a little bit of DIY happiness leads to utter misery. Just a little bit of DIY happiness. We're going to see that in the end of chapter 33. So that's on your sheets, if it helps you, and then you can wait to turn to the Bibles when we get to chapter 34. I've put 33 and 35, the bits we're looking at, on the sheets, and you've got the outline there. Okay, so here we are in this theme of just a little bit of DIY happiness. So here is Jacob with his large family now, huge wealth, reconciled with his brother, crossing the river into the promised land. And then in this reconciliation with his brother Esau says this. There it is on your sheets or in the Bible on page 37. Then Esau said, Genesis 33 verse 12, "Let us be on our way, I'll accompany you." But Jacob said to him, "Oh, my Lord knows that the children are tender and that I must care for the ewes and cows that are nursing their young. If they are driven hard just one day, all the animals will die." So let my Lord go ahead of his servant, while I move along slowly at the pace of the flocks and herds before me and the pace of the children, until I come to my Lord in Seir. So here is Jacob, humbled enough to now call Esau his Lord or his master. He's recognizing in humility. And yet, even as he sees God answer his prayer amazingly with this reconciliation to Esau, he just can't quite trust God enough. And in comes the scheming and the lying. We discover this is a lie, that he said, I'm going to follow you on to Seir, south of modern-day Israel, where Esau and his family ended up resting. This is a lie. Jacob could have said, look, no, I'm not going to come with you. God has promised that I'm going to go to Bethel. That's where he's heading. But instead of telling it truthfully, Jacob just decides, I'm going to scheme rather than tell the truth. And we need to identify where that muscle memory of deceit or the habits that we've built up over time, whatever they might be, are coming through. Well, Esau said, verse 15, well then let me leave some of my men with you. But why do that? Jacob asked. Let me find favor in the eyes of my Lord. And so that day Esau started on his way back to Seir. Jacob, however, having lied, went to Succoth, where he built a place for himself and made shelters for his livestock. That is why the place is called Succoth. Now, this place, Succoth, is again just on the edge of the land. God has said, Jacob, come back to the land that I promised your forefathers. Come back to Bethel, where I met you and revealed myself to you in that amazing encounter where heaven was opened and heaven came down and God revealed himself to Jacob. And yet Jacob sort of stays on the edge. He's hedging his bets. And we don't know exactly how long he rested there, but it must have been approaching years. We're not exactly sure of timings here. But there's some sense of Jacob being also spiritually passive, just not engaging with what the Lord has asked him to do. So then, verse 18, after Jacob came from Paddan Aram, it's interesting that the author here, Moses, just reminds us of where he's come from, way back with his uncle Laban, where he was in slavery, effectively. After Jacob came from Paddan Aram, he arrived safely at the city of Shechem in Canaan and camped within sight of the city. Now, when I first read that, it didn't mean anything in particular to me, except that we know Jacob is going to Bethel. And so I looked up, how far is Shechem from Bethel? Well, the distance from Paddan Aram, where Jacob was in slavery, to Bethel is 400 miles. Whereas the distance from Shechem to Bethel is 30 miles. So Jacob has come 93% of the way. And then he pauses. And Shechem was a wealthy place, a prosperous place, but also, as we're going to find out, quite a dangerous and dodgy place. And again, Jacob hedges his bets and he makes camp within sight of the city. And that phrase in the Hebrew would wake us up to think back to Abraham's life and his nephew Lot, who set up camp, who established himself within sight of the city of Sodom. Sodom, a very wealthy place with lots of fertile land, and yet morally exceedingly compromised and dangerous. And it's like Jacob is just doing the same thing again. And maybe he's justifying it by saying to himself, I've come 93% of the way there. He probably didn't think of it in those percentages. I've got most of the way there. There's only one day left, and at any time I can just gather my family. We live in tents, we're easily mobile. We can just pick up and head on down to Bethel. But with that compromise, he then gets ensnared. And I imagine that there are things in our lives where we think, the Lord has brought me so far, and I've made so much progress, and things are going really well. But, I don't need to commit to that thing that the Lord has commanded me to. I don't really, I can get really stuck into church at any time. And there's this busyness stuff going on here, and I just need to prioritize that at the moment. Or I've just had real success and victory in dealing with sexual sin, But there are just those one or two images on the internet that I just keep going back to. And compromise, it gets us precisely by looking safe. Precisely by looking safe. I heard the story this week of an American called Lindsay Jacobellis, who was a great snowboarding champion. Connor, have you heard of her? Connor's big into snowboarding now. In the Winter Olympics in 2006, Lindsay Jacobellis...
wasn't born then.
Yes, he was. Lindsay Jacobellis was doing really, really well, and in the final race, she was way ahead of all the competition. You may have heard this on the news back then, or heard it since, because she was absolutely guaranteed to win. You could see with the cameras that the other competitors were way behind her. There was no way they were going to catch up. And in the last straight, she looks round and she sees her nearest competitor as a dot on the horizon, and she thinks, this is it. And so on the last jump, as she's heading the stretch, she just does an extra trick that she wouldn't normally have done. Quite a simple one, something that wasn't too risky, but something she definitely wouldn't have done if the competition had been that little bit closer. And you can guess what happens. She has a massive fall, and it was one of the most tragic silver medals that has ever been awarded, as the Swiss woman raced past her for the gold, and she had to sort of crawl to victory. And, this is what's going on in Jacob's life. He's so nearly there, and he gets complacent, and he turns to a little bit of DIY happiness. And you see verse 19, for 100 pieces of silver, he bought from the sons of Hamor, the father of Shechem. So this area, this city, is named after the prince. So there's kind of the king, Hamor, and then the prince, Shechem. He bought from him the plot of ground where he pitched his tent. And there he set up an altar and called it El Elohi Israel, the God of Israel. But it's interesting what he'd called the first place that he'd set up an altar. It was called Bethel, the house of God, and that's where he was supposed to be going. And it's almost as if Jacob is just setting up kind of compromised worship. He's introducing compromise into his worship. And he's thinking, well, I can always go on that extra one day's journey when I feel like it. I can always stop that sinful habit when I put my mind to it. But actually what happens is, and for this you want to open your Bibles to page 37 and Genesis 34. This is right towards the supposed kind of pinnacle of Jacob's maturity as a Christian, as a believer, as a follower of God. And it's just very, very sad. And I'm going to read it to you, comment a little bit, and then we'll have a bit of time to discuss it. Genesis 34. And as we read it, you're going to be thinking, what is this chapter doing here? But I also want you to be thinking this. After this, we're going to be discussing which characters do you identify with. Which characters do you identify with? You're going to find it hard to see yourself initially in it. But I think this is also a mirror for us. Chapter 34, verse 1. Now, Dinah, the daughter Leah had born to Jacob. That's an important detail. Do you remember Rachel was the one he preferred? Leah was the one he ended up with. Dinah, the daughter of Leah, had born to Jacob, went out to visit the women of the land. Now, guessing here, Dinah must be about 15, and her brothers are between the ages of 16 to 22. Her going out to visit the women of the land might not sound particularly significant, except that we're told that elsewhere in the Abraham, Isaac, Jacob narrative, that the women of Canaan and the people of Canaan were known to be highly unsuitable, dangerous, that they would drag God's people away from the worship of God, and so on. And that they had character traits that, just made them morally horrific. And Dinah, as a 15-year-old girl, is just going to explore and take a look. That word visit means sort of take a look, inspect. Verse 2, when Shechem, son of Hamor the Hivite, the ruler of that area, saw her, he took her and raped her. Literally, he seized her, and the word there that's translated raped is actually two words. He first had sex with her and then violated and humiliated her. This is rape and sexual brutality. This is just horrific, tragic. The only daughter of Jacob, the only sister to those brothers, just in a moment of lust and wanting to get his hands on her, Shechem ruins her life. And if you've had anything even close to this, please do make sure that you, if you want to just talk to someone in the church, if you're a woman here and you want to talk to someone in the church, I can set you up with someone who'd be able to counsel you on that. If you're a bloke and you've been through something like this, or anything even close, this might bring back horrible memories, and I don't want to just gloss over it as a piece of history. This could be very personal and very tragic to many. And what goes on in the next bit is probably common to many of these horrific rape cases. The next thing is the cover-up. Verse 3, we see the conflict here. Shechem's heart was drawn to Dinah, daughter of Jacob. See the emphasis there, it's Jacob's daughter. He loved the young woman and spoke tenderly to her. Just imagine how that would feel, having been violated in that way, and then he's kind of torn, and that the horror of that kind of sexual desire that then turns to love and getting everything completely the wrong way round, and yet the men here especially will probably know that horrible feeling of those things mixing up, especially those who are dabbling in pornography, which is statistically just such a common thing. Anyway, there's this funny mixed motive, it's tragic, and then Shechem said to his father Hamor, because he's the prince, he can say it like this, "Get me this girl as my wife." He kind of wants to make it right and cover it up. And so you'd expect Jacob to step in here. But verse 5, when Jacob heard that his daughter Dinah had been defiled, and that's a big word. She has not only been raped, but also she's experiencing something that breaks relationships in a way that reflects on relationships with God. The covenant community has been damaged here. Not that it's her fault at all, but this tragedy has entered this family. When Jacob heard that his daughter Dinah had been defiled, his sons were in the fields with his livestock, so he did nothing. Literally, he kept quiet about it until they came home. Then Shechem's father Hamor went out to talk with Jacob. Meanwhile, Jacob's sons had come in from the fields. As soon as they heard what had happened, they were shocked and furious because Shechem had done an outrageous thing in Israel by sleeping with Jacob's daughter, a thing that should not be done. The sin is horrific. Justice should be done. But then, verse 8, Hamor said to them, "My son Shechem has his heart set on your daughter. Please give her to him as a wife, intermarry with us. Give us your daughters and take our daughters for yourselves. You can settle among us. The land is open to you. Live in it, trade or move freely in it, and acquire property in it." Then Shechem said to Dinah's father and brothers, "Let me find favor in your eyes, and I will give you whatever you ask. Make the price for the bride and the gift I am to bring as great as you like, and I'll pay whatever you ask me. Only give me the young woman as my wife." When everything else fails, just throw money at the problem. Try and sort it out by some big family cover-up. Then verse 13, because their sister Dinah had been defiled, Jacob's sons replied deceitfully as they spoke to Shechem and his father Hamor. They said to them, "We can't do such a thing. We can't give our sister to a man who is not circumcised. That would be a disgrace to us. We will enter into an agreement with you on one condition only, that you become like us by circumcising all your males. Then we will give you our daughters and take your daughters for ourselves. We'll settle among you and become one people with you. But if you will not agree to be circumcised, we'll take our sister and go." Their proposal seemed good to Hamor and his son Shechem. The young man, who was the most honoured of all his father's family, lost no time in doing what they said, because he was delighted with Jacob's daughter. So Hamor and his son Shechem went to the gates of their city to speak to the men of their city. "These men are friendly towards us," they said. "Let them live in our land and trade in it. The land has plenty of room for them. We can marry their daughters and they can marry ours. But the men will agree to live with us as one people only on the condition that our males be circumcised, and as they themselves are. Won't their livestock, their property, and all their other animals become ours? So let us agree to their terms, and they will settle among us." So we see the greed motivating this deal. And so all the men who went out of the city gate agreed with Hamor and his son Shechem, and every male in the city was circumcised. And my guess is that they thought, it's just a little piece of skin. It's not going to be that sore. But if you happen to look it up, and I suggest you don't, then you will discover that this is probably the most painful operation that can be done to a man. There are medical reasons why men still have it today, and if they don't have it done to them as babies, as Jacob's sons would have done, then it is immensely painful. It's probably the equivalent for the man of, in terms of pain, of a C-section, and they are then incapacitated. And so, verse 25, 3 days later, while all of them were still in pain, very, very painful, two of Jacob's sons, Simeon and Levi, Dinah's brothers, took their swords and attacked the unsuspecting city, killing every male. They put Hamor and his son Shechem to the sword and took Dinah. You see, they took Dinah. So she must have been sort of held captive. This deal that was going on was while she was held captive. They took Dinah from Shechem's house and left. The sons of Jacob came upon the dead bodies and looted the city where their sister had been defiled. They seized their flocks and herds and donkeys and everything else of theirs in the city and out in the fields. They carried off all their wealth and all their women and children, taking as plunder everything in the houses. Their sister Dinah was raped, so they rape the whole city, violating it, taking everything out. Jacob hears about this. And look what he's concerned about. Verse 30. Then Jacob said to Simeon and Levi, "You have brought trouble on me by making me obnoxious to the Canaanites and Perizzites, the people living in this land. We are few in number, and if they join forces against me and attack me, I and my household will be destroyed." It's not actually true, because God had said that he would walk with Jacob and protect him, and that he would make him a great nation. But Jacob is self-concerned, self-serving. But they replied with an issue of justice. Should he have treated our sister like a prostitute? And that's how the chapter ends and hangs. And so it may be pretty surprising that I've said, discuss which characters do you identify with. You probably hope that you don't identify with any of them. But the big debate here is between convenience and justice. Convenience and justice. And maybe you could identify which characters fall into those categories and who in the story you identify with. I'm just going to give you 3 or 4 minutes just in your groups around you to chat about that question. I imagine there are some here, and I don't think you'd want to speak out as it, but almost see ourselves in the person of Shechem. That there he is, he's followed his lusts, but he does actually genuinely seem to want to be with this girl. So he's done a horrific act, which is an imprisonable offence in today's world. He deserves justice done against him, and yet he's sort of, but I also have a heart. And it's really striking that we could just immediately condemn him. I was really struck by a Christian judge who was asked, what difference does it make to you as a High Court judge? And he said, I'm very careful that when I pronounce the sentence on a convicted criminal, that I say, you have done an absolutely terrible or evil thing. Whereas other judges might say, you are an evil person. And we do horrific things, but it's important to make that distinction. So, just a few reflections that you've been giving already. The big differences are between Jacob, who did nothing and really kind of only cared about himself and his own self-preservation. This chapter actually gives us a slight insight into why Leah's sons would then treat Joseph so badly in the Joseph story that's coming up. Because Jacob treats his only daughter and their only sister so badly. So Jacob loved Rachel and preferred his sons from Rachel, Joseph and Benjamin. Well, Leah's sons might want to take their revenge. Some of you will have heard me use the illustration before that I found so powerful when I went to London Men's Convention a number of years ago, where I heard the story of a father who found it easier, true story, of a father who found it easier to let his daughter go out with an inappropriate man who was not a Christian, and it was obvious to the father that this man was after one thing only. But his daughter was very insistent, and he just thought the easiest thing to do was to be passive. And instead of lovingly warning his daughter and helping her work it through and praying with her and coming alongside her, he just gave in and let her do whatever she wanted. And then that boy forced himself on her, effectively raping her, and she ended up utterly miserable. And she was so broken by that experience that the father said, oh, you need to go to the pastor and his wife for some counselling. But she asked her father to come with her to meet their pastor and wife, and the father was just sitting there and listening in as she told the story. And during that meeting, it turned out that the daughter was desperately upset with her dad. And the dad turned to his daughter and he said, I don't know what you're blaming me for. I didn't do anything. And the pastor stood up and in a rage said, that is your sin. You didn't do anything. You were passive, not proactive. Why weren't you there praying for her and encouraging her and coming alongside her? Instead, you just let her go into danger because that was the easiest thing. And I think men especially, those in protective positions, but all of us, we need to be proactive, not passive. But then on the flip side, the brothers took justice into their own hands and just turned to revenge and then plunder. As they went the extra level, and they thought, oh, well, great, we can just have all this stuff now that we've taken over the city. And so you get this horrible kind of mess of one seeking convenience in his own DIY happiness and leading to horror against his daughter and his family, and then the other, just this horrific revenge. And in a moment, we're going to reflect on Psalm 12, where we get to see God's people crying out to God to bring justice. And often it's uncomfortable. We come across these psalms again and again where God's people are crying out for God to bring justice and enact punishment on the wicked. And yet that is the right way forward, to give justice to the Lord rather than take it back into our own hands. But also as we come to the end of chapter 34 and thinking, why is this in the Bible? Well, it's here to remind us that we are to, in the utter misery, go back to the God of grace, to go back to the God of grace. And so on your sheets, you'll see Genesis 35. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this. But you see the grace of God step into this absolute mess and horror. Jacob is now fearful that the whole of the Canaanites are going to arm themselves against him. His family is falling apart. But God in his grace comes to him again and just says the same thing. Then God said to Jacob, "Go up to Bethel," which means the house of God. It's the place where God met with Jacob and promised his grace to Jacob. It was the place effectively where he was converted. "Go back to Bethel and settle there and build an altar there to God who appeared to you when you were fleeing from your brother Esau, when you had nothing, and now you've got all this." And so Jacob said to his household and to all who were with him, and here we see repentance across the first church. You see, they were all compromised, we discover here, because Jacob says to him, "Get rid of the foreign gods you have with you, and purify yourselves, and change your clothes." So they had all these little gods. They were all hedging their bets in different ways. And Jacob finally leads his family in destroying these foreign gods. "Then, come, let us go up to Bethel, where I will build an altar to God, who answered me in the day of my distress, and who has been with me wherever I have gone." So they gave Jacob all the foreign gods they had and the rings in their ears, and Jacob buried them under the oak at Shechem. They left them there, and then they set out. And Jacob didn't need to worry about being protected. He didn't need to settle in Shechem in the first place to make economic alliances with these guys, because we're told the terror of God fell on all the towns around them so that no one pursued them. They were protected as they headed back to the promised land. And verse 6, Jacob and all the people with him came to Luz, that is Bethel, in the land of Canaan. And there he built an altar, and he called the place El Bethel, the God of the house of God. It's almost like he's reaffirming, because it was there that God revealed himself to him when he was fleeing from his brother. And as we close, I want you to think about, what does it mean for you to go back to Bethel? Where is it that you first put your trust in Christ? It may be that you, like me, can remember the spot where you were. I think of my bed in my dormitory when I was about 15, where I first prayed a prayer, having read the testimony of a prisoner whose life had been saved through Christ. Or that place where the Lord met me and changed my life in terms of realizing the need for other people to hear about Jesus and just how kind God had been to me. But it needn't be a place, because Jesus meets, in John chapter 4, Jesus meets the woman at the well here at Shechem, on the border between Samaria and Israel. And they have a debate about where's the right place to worship. And Jesus says, "No, I'm the Messiah. I'm the one you've been waiting for. And through me, the Holy Spirit is going to come upon you. And then it doesn't matter whether you worship in Jerusalem or in Samaria, but that you worship God in spirit and in truth," Jesus says. "True worshippers will worship the Father in spirit and in truth." This is a horrible chapter, especially chapter 34, but it's been weirdly helpful to me this week. This week I heard the news, and some of you might have heard of it. It's big news in the leaders of conservative evangelical churches, because a man called Jonathan Fletcher, who actually personally mentored me quite a lot and been very significant in my life, amazing church leader, ran Emmanuel Wimbledon, which planted Dundonald, which planted Christchurch Balham, which planted us. Jonathan Fletcher recently has been subject of a safeguarding scandal, nothing criminal, but something that comes under the terminology of spiritual abuse, over-exercising his power to get those he's discipling to do stuff that they were deeply uncomfortable with. And being in Genesis 34 has been a great help to me. Here is Jacob, a mature believer, looked like everything was going so well, and yet, well, couldn't be worse, could it? And the scars of this episode remain, and the scars of whatever you have either done or has been done to you will remain, in one sense, throughout your life. But the God of Bethel came to Jacob as a kind of foreshadowing of the Lord Jesus Christ, the eternal Son of God, who stepped down. And just there at the bottom of your sheets, bottom left of your sheets, 2 Corinthians 5, 20 to 21. Paul is writing to Christians. And he says, we implore you on Christ's behalf, be reconciled to God. You know, we may be thinking, I've screwed up again. How can I? I've been a Christian for so long. I've made so many promises to the Lord. I've committed myself to him, and I messed up again and again and again. But Paul says, no, be reconciled to God, because God made him who had no sin to be sin for us, so that in him we might become the righteousness of God. And if we understand who we are in Christ, it'll make us not want to do any of those things, but also it'll mean that we can be open about our failures and our struggles. And we can have accountability that it turned out that this wonderful Christian leader, Jonathan Fletcher, didn't really have. He was a kind of leader of one. And his main accountability was from very young men who he was discipling. It was inappropriate. He needed peers to be testing him and challenging him and fostering a culture of openness. And we need to do that because we see in ourselves the traits of these characters in this horrific story. And we don't do it in our actions because we don't have the opportunity, but in our heads we do, don't we? The stuff that we think about people, the sexual thoughts and fantasies that we have in our heads, if we put them on the screen, as is talked about so many times, you know, we just have to hang our heads in shame, you know, we become suicidal, we want to get out. We have these character traits, and we need each other to say, we're not saved by what we do, by being impressive, developing church leaders or whatever it is. We're saved by the grace of God, and Christians need to hear, we implore you on Christ's behalf, be reconciled to God. God made him who had no sin to be sin for us, so that in him we might become the righteousness of God.